Hello. My name is Luna. The morning it all ended was just like any other quiet. Cold. Routine. The only sound in the kitchen was the soft clink of David's spoon tapping against his coffee mug. I sat across from him, hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of something I didn't want to name. Outside, the fog still clung to the windows. The Oregon sky low and heavy. It should have felt comforting, familiar. But that day, it felt like a curtain closing. David didn't look at me. Not really. He kept his eyes on the swirl of cream in his mug like it was telling him something I couldn't. We had done this dance for years, the silent breakfasts, the strained smiles, the weather updates that passed for conversation. But that morning, something in the silence felt louder. He stirred once more, set the spoon down carefully, then finally spoke. If I could go back, he said flatly, I don't think I would have gotten married. He didn't say my name. He didn't even sound angry. That would have been easier. Anger you can argue with. Anger you can fight. But what he gave me wasn't anger. It was indifference, calm, cold, calculated. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't tell him how much that one sentence cracked open the floor beneath me. I just stood up. Slowly, pressing one hand against the table to keep myself grounded. I walked out of the kitchen like someone leaving a room they no longer had permission to be in. Upstairs. Everything looked untouched. My robe hung where it always did. His cologne sat capped on the dresser. On his nightstand, the glass tray I gave him on our anniversary still held the same cufflinks. It felt surreal, like walking through the ghost of a life. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a quiet realization humming beneath my skin. This is it. This is how it ends. Not with fire, not with betrayal, but with the slow, silent cooling of something that once was warm. And in that stillness, something inside me whispered back, then maybe. Luna. It's time to begin. I met David in the fall of 1986. Back when I still believed that love was mostly about showing up. I was 23. Freshly graduated from the University of Oregon with a teaching degree and a heart full of borrowed furniture, student debt, and secondhand dreams. I had just landed a job teaching 3rd grade in Ashland and rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a bookstore that smelled like paper and rain. David worked at his father's auto shop on the edge of town. He wasn't flashy. He didn't flirt. But he had this quiet, solid energy, like a truck that never broke down. We met through mutual friends at a backyard barbecue. He brought the potato salad. I brought my laughter. He didn't say much that night. But when he offered to walk me to my car, I said yes. He wasn't the kind of man who brought flowers or wrote love notes. But when my faucet leaked, he fixed it without asking. When a snowstorm hit, he scraped the ice off my windshield before I woke up. When I had a bad day at school, he just listened, nodding slowly as if every word mattered. That's what made me fall for him. He was steady. We got married in May beneath a rented white canopy in Marcy's backyard. I wore a simple dress, my sister's veil, and shoes that pinched all night. David built our first dining table with leftover cedar planks from a neighbor's fence. It wobbled a little, but it was ours. When our daughter Emily was born 2 years later, I took a leave from teaching. Then Caleb came along 3 years after that. And the leave turned permanent. We couldn't afford daycare. And David was working overtime at the shop. I convinced myself it was the right thing. This is motherhood. I told myself, this is love. And so I built a life around holding everyone else together. The mornings were mine. Pancakes with syrup, smiley faces, lunchboxes with sticky notes. The evenings were for checking homework, folding laundry, reheating casseroles. Every Sunday, I made coffee just the way David liked it, black, with a splash of cream. No sugar. I memorized his schedule, his habits, the sound of his truck in the driveway. I told myself we were stable. I told my friends we were steady, not passionate. But dépendable. What I didn't tell anyone, what I didn't let myself say out loud, was how often I had to remind myself that this was enough. That the absence of cruelty was the same as love. Because that's what I believed for a long time. That if someone stayed, if they worked hard, if they didn't leave, then they must love you. Right. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, David stopped showing up. Not physically. He came home every night. But the man I married, the one who scraped my windshield and listened to my classroom stories, he disappeared. And I filled the silence with rituals. I made pot roast on Thursdays. I planted marigolds in the front yard. I kept us spinning. But I think, deep down, I already knew. I was the only one still dancing. It didn't all fall apart in one day. That's the lie people tell in books and movies. The truth is, the unraveling was so slow it almost felt kind. Like an old sweater losing shape thread by thread, memory by memory, until one day it no longer fit. And you couldn't remember when it ever did. After David's quiet confession at the breakfast table, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't even bring it up again. Instead, I became smaller. I stopped asking him to sit with me on the porch after dinner. I stopped sharing the funny things the kids said when they called. I stopped filling the space between us with hope. It wasn't bitterness. It was resignation. I remember standing in the grocery store one afternoon, staring at two kinds of pasta sauce, unable to choose. Not because I cared which one he liked, but because I realized, in that moment, that I didn't know what I liked. I had spent so many years orbiting around other people's needs, David's, Emily's, Caleb's, that I'd forgotten I had preferences of my own. And then came the silence. Not between us that had been there for years, but inside me. A hush that settled in my chest like snow. It wasn't peace. It was absence. I began to wonder, when was the last time someone asked me how I was? When was the last time I laughed so hard I couldn't breathe? When was the last time I touched something that made me feel alive? It was around that time I started going on long walks by myself. At first it was just to get out of the house. But eventually, I started walking farther through town, along the river trail, into neighborhoods I'd never explored. There was something healing in movement, something sacred in leaving the walls that had contained so much of my quiet pain. One morning, I walked into a secondhand bookstore. I used to love reading before the kids were born. Before dishes and laundry and school meetings stole my nights. I picked up a copy of The Awakening by Kate Chopin. The irony nearly made me laugh. I took it home, sat on the porch, and read until the sun dipped behind the trees. That night, something shifted. Not in David, not in our marriage, but in me, a tiny ember. Not of anger, not of rebellion, of curiosity. Who was I before the wife, before the mother, before I built my life around keeping things from breaking? That question didn't scare me anymore. It felt like the beginning of a long-forgotten song. One I'd stopped humming years ago. And I wasn't ready to sing it out loud yet. But I was listening. A few weeks later, I found myself parked outside a community center on a Tuesday evening, gripping the steering wheel like it might save me from drowning. There was a flyer posted at the library bulletin board: Intro to Acrylic Painting. No experience needed. I stared at it for days before I registered. Not because I had a secret passion for painting. Not because I was trying to reinvent myself. I just wanted to sit in a room where no one expected anything from me. That first night, I almost didn't go in. I sat in the car for a full 10 minutes. Heart racing, like I was walking into a courtroom instead of an art class. But then I saw an older woman with wild gray curls walk past me, carrying a giant tackle box full of brushes and a smile that looked like permission. I followed her in. The room smelled like coffee and linseed oil, folding tables, plastic aprons, quiet jazz playing from a corner speaker. I sat in the back. The instructor, a retired art teacher named Rachel, handed me a blank canvas and said, "No rules. Just start." And I did. I dipped the brush in blue, then green. Then I painted a mess of waves crashing into each other. I didn't know what I was doing. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to apologize for it. I kept coming back every Tuesday. I never told David. It wasn't a secret. I just didn't owe him that explanation anymore. Something about that hour each week peeled back layers I didn't know I had. I began journaling again. I bought myself a used bike and started riding through Lithia Park before sunrise. I signed up for a poetry reading just to listen. And slowly, the silence inside me began to break. It wasn't a dramatic awakening. No tearful revelations. It was gentle, like rain soaking into dry ground. David noticed, but he didn't ask. He just watched me with a kind of distant confusion. And that's when I realized he wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He just wasn't coming with me. Whatever road I was on now, I was walking it alone. And for the first time in my life, that didn't scare me. I didn't plan to leave. Not at first. I just kept building a life that belonged to me. Inch by inch. Breath by breath. But then came the morning. Everything changed. I was making coffee. Barefoot in the kitchen. Sunlight streaming through the windows like forgiveness. David walked in, opened the fridge, and said, "We're out of orange juice." That's all. A simple sentence. A normal sentence. But something inside me broke open. Because the night before, I had stayed up late writing a letter to myself. A letter that said, "You are allowed to choose you." I had cried while writing it. Not because I was sad, but because I had finally believed it. And now, that morning, with his back turned, all he could see was what was missing. Not what had changed, not who I'd become, just the juice. I didn't reply. I walked past him, out onto the porch, barefoot and still holding my coffee. I stood in the quiet morning and let the truth settle like dust. It was time. That afternoon, I packed a bag. Just one. Not because I was running, but because I was finally walking toward something. I left a note. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It simply said, "David, I hope one day you'll understand. But even if you don't, I need to find myself before I disappear completely. Luna." I moved into a small rental above a bookstore in town. The ceiling creaked. The shower whined. But every corner of it felt like mine. At first, I felt guilty. There were nights I missed the sound of the dishwasher running, or the way David used to leave the porch light on when I came home late. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in years. Air. Room to stretch. To exhale. To remember the sound of my own laugh echoing in a space that didn't require permission. I started painting full-time. I sold my first piece at a local gallery. It wasn't much. But when the curator handed me the check, I cried in the parking lot. Because it felt like someone had finally said, "Yes, you exist." I began leading art therapy classes for women at the center. Some were younger than me. Some older. All of them were carrying invisible weights. Just like I had. One night, after class, a woman named Tasha grabbed my hand, and whispered, "Thank you for showing us we can start over." And I realized I wasn't just healing myself anymore. I was handing out matches, lighting sparks in women who thought they were too late. But we're never too late. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Sometimes we spend our whole lives waiting for permission to be happy, to take up space, to begin again. But maybe the only permission we ever needed was our own. A year passed, not marked by grand milestones or dramatic turns, but by quiet victories, the kind that no one claps for. But that changed everything. I had started journaling every morning with my coffee. It became a ritual, like sweeping the dust out of my mind. I no longer wrote letters to myself out of desperation. Now I wrote them out of celebration. Dear Luna, you showed up today. You mattered today. That's enough. Ashland began to feel less like a place I escaped to and more like a place I belonged in. I learned the names of the baristas at the corner cafe. The bookstore owner started putting aside titles she thought I'd love. I was no longer invisible. Then one afternoon, while setting up for an art class, a woman walked in mid-30s, hunched shoulders, holding a flyer in trembling hands. She said her name was Erica. Said she hadn't painted since she was a teenager. Said she didn't know who she was anymore. I handed her a blank canvas, just like Rachel had done for me. By the end of the hour, she had painted nothing but red, just layers and layers of deep, aching red. She cried as she cleaned her brush, and I told her, "That's more than enough." That night, I walked home under a sky full of stars. And it hit me. Maybe our healing isn't just for us. Maybe our stories become the stepping stones for others. Maybe the cracks we repair in ourselves shine a light through the darkness for someone else still lost. I thought about David sometimes. He had reached out once. A short message, "I miss you. I don't understand, but I hope you're okay." I never replied. Not out of bitterness, but because I had nothing left to explain. My story wasn't about him anymore. It was about Luna, the woman who had once begged for permission to breathe, now showing others how to inhale without apology. The woman who had once shrunk herself to fit inside someone else's comfort, now stretching her arms wide in a room full of women doing the same. Sometimes people ask me, "Do you regret it leaving?" And I smile. Because, how do you regret walking into your own life? I didn't leave a marriage. I returned to myself. And in doing that, I found something I never thought I would again. Hope. Quiet. Steady. Unshakable. A hope that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. A hope that paints in bold colors. A hope that signs her name in the corner of the canvas and finally believes she's allowed to be seen. The day I opened my first solo gallery show, I stood in the middle of the room, completely still. As people walked past me, pausing, admiring, absorbing pieces of my soul that had once only existed in silence. Each painting was a chapter, not of perfection, but of permission. One woman stopped in front of a canvas I had titled "The Morning I Chose Myself." It was textured, layered, soft in some places, raw in others. She turned to me, not knowing I was the artist, and whispered, "It feels like freedom." That's when I knew this story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a mirror, a spark, a key. I watched as people moved through the gallery, young women, older couples, even a few men with their arms crossed until something hit them so hard they had to look away. That night, after everyone had gone and the lights were dimmed, I stood in the middle of that quiet room and cried. Not from sadness, but from awe. Awe at how far I had come. From a woman who once couldn't speak above a whisper without second-guessing herself, to someone who had found her voice not in shouting, but in showing the cracks, the climb, the courage. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a local college, a lecture on art and healing. I almost said no. The old fear returned, the one that asked, "Who are you to teach anyone?" But I've learned something about fear: it doesn't leave. It just gets quieter when your truth gets louder. So I said yes. I walked onto that stage, palm sweating, heart thumping, and I told my story. Not the polished version, the real one. I told them about the silence, about losing myself, about red paint in Rachel's hands and orange juice mornings and keys in the ignition without knowing where I'd end up. I told them that healing isn't a straight line, that some days you'll glow, and others you'll crawl. And when I finished, the room was silent. Then one student in the back stood up and asked, "How did you know it was time?" And I said, "When the fear of staying became greater than the fear of leaving." That line has followed me ever since. It's written on a sticky note above my easel. It's what I tell every woman who walks into my class with trembling hands and tired eyes. Because here's the truth: you are allowed to begin again. You are allowed to rewrite the ending. And you are allowed to call it beautiful. I'm Luna. And I didn't just survive. I became, and so can you. A year after my gallery show, I received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. Just one word on the envelope: Luna. Inside was a short note. "I saw your painting at the exhibit. The one with the window and the cracked light. I stood there for an hour. I don't know how to leave yet. But because of you, I now believe it's possible. Thank you. M." I never found out who M was. But that letter changed something in me. It reminded me that healing doesn't echo loudly. It ripples quietly, softly through lives. We may never touch directly, but still somehow reach. That's the thing. No one tells you about transformation. It's contagious. I began volunteering at a shelter downtown once a week. Just listening. Just showing up. Not to rescue anyone, but to remind them they weren't alone. Sometimes that's all a person needs. A mirror that doesn't lie. A voice that doesn't rush. A face that doesn't flinch at their truth. One night, a woman named Valerie sat beside me during an art workshop. She hadn't spoken the entire time. She was drawing a house, but the windows were bricked up, and the door was missing. She looked at me and said, "I don't remember how to draw an open door." I didn't respond right away. Then I reached for my pencil and drew a tiny key next to her picture. "You don't have to know how," I told her. "Just believe it's there." She smiled. And for the first time, tears filled her eyes. Moments like that, quiet, weightless, wholly reminded me why I stayed. Why I built a life not out of reaction, but intention. Ashland became more than a place of refuge. It became my sanctuary. People often ask me if I've found love again. And the truth is, I have. But not in the way they mean. I fell in love with the sunrise through my window. The scent of acrylic paint on my fingertips. The sound of strangers turning into sisters. And the silence of a room where I no longer had to apologize for existing. And I fell in love with Luna, the woman who waited so patiently beneath the wreckage, trusting that someday, someone would come for her, and that someone turned out to be herself. This story, my story, is not about escape. It's about awakening. It's not about hate or blame. It's about choice. The choice to unlearn shame, to rebuild joy, to remember who you were before the world taught you to forget. If you're listening to this right now, wondering if you're too far gone, too late, too broken, let me be your reminder. You are not. You are right on time. Your story is still unfolding. And the best part, you get to write the ending. Not long after that, something unexpected happened. I was invited to speak at a women's conference in Portland, not as a painter, not as a survivor, but as a teacher of transformation. At first, I hesitated. Who was I to stand on that stage, to wear a microphone and call myself anything more than a girl who simply survived? But then I remembered Valerie's drawing. The bricked windows, the missing door, and the tiny key I had drawn beside it. That key wasn't just for her. It had always been for me, too. So I packed my bag, printed out a few slides, and drove north. The highway hummed like a song I didn't know the words to, but somehow remembered the melody of. When I stepped onto that stage, I didn't give a speech. I told a story. My story. I talked about the woman I used to be. The girl who thought silence kept her safe. The mornings I couldn't get out of bed. The times I stayed when I knew I should have run. I talked about red paint. About Rachel. About the diner that smelled like cinnamon and second chances. And I told them this. No one walks out of the fire the same. But if you let it, the fire doesn't just burn. It refines. The room was still. Then came the claps. The tears. The questions. But what I remember most was a young woman in the front row. She raised her hand and asked me, "How did you forgive yourself?" It stopped me, because no one had ever asked me that out loud. I looked at her, really looked, and said, "I stopped waiting for someone else to do it first." That answer didn't come from wisdom. It came from wounds. And that's what made it honest. After the conference, I was approached by a woman named Diane. She ran a nonprofit arts center for young girls who had survived trauma. She asked if I would come teach a class just once, just to share a little of what I'd lived. I agreed. But once turned into twice. Twice turned into monthly visits. And before I knew it, Ashland Girls Studio was born. It wasn't fancy, just a single room above a florist shop, with donated brushes and mismatched easels. But it was sacred, because it gave girls the one thing I never had growing up: a place to speak without words. A place where a brushstroke could say, "I'm still here." And color could whisper, "I'm not afraid anymore." And sometimes, in the quiet moments after class, when the sun slanted just right through the window, I'd stand there alone and smile. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally believed I was exactly as I was. And that was more than enough. A year after the Ashland Girls Studio opened, something happened that reminded me how far I had come and how far we all could go. One afternoon, I found a letter slipped under the studio door. It was handwritten in neat, careful script. No name. No return address. Just the words, "You don't know me, but I've been watching." Not in a creepy way, more like from the shadows. I've sat in the back of your workshops. I've pretended to be just a friend of a friend. I was terrified to be seen. Terrified to speak. But last week, I painted something for the first time in years. And I cried. And I smiled. And I realized I wasn't broken. I was just waiting for a place to heal. You gave me that. Thank you, Luna. I held that letter in my hands for a long time. It wasn't just a thank you, it was proof. Proof that quiet transformation is still transformation. That healing doesn't need applause to be real. That what we give? Even when we feel small or uncertain, I can ripple into lives we'll never fully see. That night, I went home, lit a candle, and sat in silence. I thought about all the versions of myself I had once tried to bury: the scared girl, the angry woman, the one who stayed too long, the one who blamed herself. And I whispered to each of them, you mattered too, because they had all built the woman I was now. Not a success story, but a becoming. Not someone who conquered everything, but someone who kept choosing to rise anyway. Since then, I've spoken at conferences across the country. I've written a book. I've painted murals in shelters, in schools, in hospitals. But more than that, I've witnessed hundreds of women pick up a brush, a pin, a guitar, or just the courage to speak their own name out loud and say, I'm still here, and I want to say this to you. 2. Whoever you are, wherever you are, reading this now, you don't need to wait for permission. You don't need to be unbroken to begin. And you don't need to have it all figured out to start walking toward yourself. Maybe your story won't be loud. Maybe it won't be neat. But it will be yours. And that makes it sacred. So go. Create. Speak. Try. Fail. Begin again. Don't ask the world if you're worthy. Tell it you are. My name is Luna, and this was never about art. It was about freedom. And the moment you believe you deserve it, your life will begin to change.